That's the role that Christ plays in Christianity, right? That's God brought down to earth. Why is Christ an ideal? Because he welcomes the catastrophe of fate.
Jordan Peterson essentially says that the only good relationships are long-term relationships, and I think this goes along with what the Bible says. And so make sure to watch till the end, because I have a Bible verse that will tie all of this together. Let's get into it.
You mentioned that you cannot be healthy in the absence of a long-term stable relationship.
Yeah, and you can't regulate your own behavior.
And eventually, short-term relationships will turn you Machiavellian, sociopathic, and potentially narcissistic.
Well, it depends on why you're pursuing them. Like, look, the data on this is crystal clear. There's no debate about this among serious psychologists, let's say. So there are two patterns of successful mating, let's say. Successful pursuit of sexual gratification. There's the mosquito model and the human model. The mosquito model is plenty of offspring, no investment. The human model is very small number of offspring, very high investment. Okay, so now take the humans. Now there's a distribution of humans. Some of them are low investment maters and some of them are high investment maters. So low investment would be many offspring, no investment. Okay, now you say, that's a strategy. It's a biological strategy. Okay, who are the people who utilize that strategy? They're Machiavellian, narcissistic, psychopathic, and sadistic. So, you know, if that's what you want, and if you're naturally like that, that will be your orientation. But if you practice that, that's also what you'll become.
For a long-term healthy and stable relationship, does that have to be with like a partner, like a husband or wife or a spouse? Or could it be, say, a brother or
that's
a child?
Better than nothing. You know, I mean, there's all sorts of
But just something to
relationships
contend with that will always keep you in check is essentially what you're saying.
Well, it's something to care for over the long run that isn't you.
Couldn't that also be, let's say, a sibling or a close friend?
Sure. I mean,
but it's just not as
we have these other
optimal
relationships, but there isn't the advantage to long-term heterosexual child-centered coupling is that it provides all those other benefits. You know, there's a polarity between men and women that's important, a fundamental orientation that's important. If you can bring both of those viewpoints to any given situation, in all likelihood, that's more advantageous. That provides a platform for children and grandchildren. So the continuity of humanity across the generations, you know, and the core of that's obviously the relationship between men and women. Are there ways of approximating that? Well, obviously, but there are approximations, you know, and that doesn't mean, obviously, there are some people who have better friendships than their marriage, but that's irrelevant with regards to the main point, because we're talking about something that's an ideal. You know, everybody falls short of the ideal. But part of the reason you can't maintain sanity isn't in your head. Like, here's a definition of sanity. You're well enough socialized so other people can tell you when you're an idiot so why is that a good solution? Well, there's a lot of other people. And if they're giving you signals all the time, all you have to do is listen. So that's a good deal for you.
What he's saying essentially is like following the biblical principle of marriage is what is the most optimal for human flourishing. Having a heterosexual relationship, one man, one woman together, getting married, living together forever, then you have babies and then you become grandchildren. It's just overall best for flourishing. And when you're going around, sleeping around, doing all this stuff, it's really only about yourself. You only care what you need. It's all for your own gain, and you're not thinking about any other person. Because if it's short term, you can do a lot of stuff without consequences. Kind of. I mean, there's lots of consequences with it, but you think there's less consequences. So let's continue to watch.
What makes you think you can regulate yourself? You're pretty complicated, you know. So we regulate ourselves socially. That's why we talk to each other. It's vital.
That's so interesting. I feel like, once again, what you're saying, I feel like I'm like struck with my pride a little bit. Like, I feel like I can regulate myself. I can always aim up or try to do what is right and think, well, I guess I'm still basing my decision-making, because a heuristic I use a lot of the time when I'm trying to decide what to do between like a moral conundrum is like, what would the optimal person in this situation do? And completely remove myself from this situation. And then I do that. But I guess that's also relating.
Well, that's right.
Yeah,
that's
being
what you've
impressed
done.
upon
Well,
by
that's right. What you've done to some, That's a good observation. What you've done to some degree is you've constructed an idealized representation of another, or a human being for that matter. That's like the Son of Man in the Christian conception. That's a good way of thinking about it. So what you're doing when you do that is no different from what, say, evangelical Christians do when they ask themselves, what would Jesus do? It's exactly the same thing.
And it's pulled from real people. It's just certain components about them.
Yeah,
so they're
the
still
ideal
technically
parts.
impressing upon me.
Yeah. You're just,
I wouldn't say it's exactly the same thing. You're going outside of yourself and saying, like, what would Jesus do, compared to someone would go outside themselves and be like, what's the right situation? What would someone else do? But what if those other people do some crazy stuff? What if they are the ones who go around sleeping around and they're the ones who's giving you all the bad advice? But Jesus would be like, wait a minute, what did Jesus say about this? He said, for in this way you must leave your father and mother and be joined together with your wife. Anyway, let's continue.
you're essentially fabricating out of whole cloth something approximating a classic religious orientation. What would someone who is ideal do in this situation? Well, see, if you delved into that, this is where the religious investigation would take place. It's like, okay, who is this ideal that you're calling upon? What's the characterization of that ideal? You could write that all down. You'd see what your ideal is. And then you'd see that it approximates the figure of the hero in mythology, insofar as it has any utility to you.
I told my friend this, and he said that is the start of religion, or that is God to people, which...
Yeah, well, that's the intermediary figure
Yeah.
in some ways. So there's the transcendent ultimate unity, let's say, but that's ineffable. It's difficult to establish a relationship with. There's some intermediary figure. That's the role that Christ plays in Christianity, right? That's God brought down to earth. Why is Christ an ideal? Because he welcomes the catastrophe of fate. Right. And so there's no ideal person who doesn't do that. I mean, James Bond does that. Seriously, like anybody that attracts your admiration is going to have that welcoming attitude towards even the difficulties of existence. Like that's going to be a stellar part of their character. Otherwise, you wouldn't admire them. You admire people who can maintain themselves across a catastrophe, right? So the most admirable person is the person who can maintain themselves the best across the worst possible catastrophe, right? And so that'll be lurking at the back of the ideal.
So welcoming suffering and welcoming the catastrophe reminds me of Man's Search for Meaning, which for me was one of the most important books I've ever read. And he also quoted a man who has a why can bear almost any how.
Right.
He's trying to use Christianity as like a gateway for them to realize, like, what if I did look to someone higher than myself? What if I did go to Jesus for these answers? And I know he plays a roundabout way of trying to be intellectual and to help people come to Christ. I feel like that's what he could do. He wants them to come to the conclusion on their own, to look to Jesus for the answers. But could be me. But I have a Bible verse now that will tie all of this together. Let's get into it. Mark chapter 10, verse 7 says, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife. I encourage you to look to the scriptures and really understand what it's trying to tell you and what's the best optimal way of living. And the scriptures tells you right here to follow a certain way. And the Bible has so many instructions and it will truly help you in so many different ways. So I thought that was so good. Shout out to Jordan Peterson, the Iced Coffee Hour. What an amazing story. And I loved watching it. Comment down below what your thoughts are on this. I'd love to hear them. We hit 7,000 subscribers over this weekend, and I really appreciate it. Love and appreciate all of you guys. And I know we can hit 10,000 by the end of the year. We could do it with your help. So thank you guys so much for loving and supporting me with everything. I would love and appreciate you all. And also, you might like this video here.